Welcome to School for Relationships. We're here today to talk about enmeshment, which is a topic that matters a lot to me because of how common it is, how many people it affects, and how deeply it can impact our mental health. So let's get into it. What is enmeshment? Enmeshment is when we are in a relationship with blurry or non existent boundaries. And what are boundaries in relationships? And why does it matter if they get blurry? So, a boundary is a limit on how we participate in a relationship. And boundaries protect our autonomy, individuality, and our right to our own thoughts and feelings in that relationship. And the key to understanding enmeshment is to think of every relationship as a balancing act, where we're looking for a balance between being there for the other person and taking care of ourselves and our needs. And growing up, we are all taught different norms around how we should approach relationships and where we should focus more of our attention. Socialization around traditional gender roles plays a big part in how we're taught to focus our energy in relationships. In many families and cultures, men are socialized to approach relationships, focusing more on themselves and their needs, and women are taught the opposite. And in other families and cultures, both men and women are raised to deny or ignore their needs and taught the values of duty, obedience, loyalty, and selfless service. This is the case for people socialized as men or women and also applies to people who identify with a different gender. Many of us grew up being taught basically that it's just good to focus more of our energy on others. And few of us are taught to seek or expect reciprocity in our relationships. And when we grow up witnessing and learning enmeshed relationship patterns, we're taught to prioritize the needs of the other person or of the relationship far over our own. And as so much of our focus goes to the other person or to maintaining the relationship, again, the boundaries that are protecting our needs and feelings can become blurry. Eventually, we can lose ourselves in a relationship. But is losing ourselves in a relationship even a bad thing? Isn't caring about others more than ourselves what we should be striving for in our relationships? For many of us, losing ourselves is what we expect and may just feel like the way relationships work. And again, many of us, especially people socialized as women, grew up receiving relentless messaging telling us to be selfless and that focusing on ourselves is selfish and bad. And because of this, many of us were taught to seek out and then also even create enmeshed relationships. This is what we learned. And then for those of us who seek enmeshment in our relationships, we do this because enmeshment can also serve as a coping mechanism. Focusing more on others can help us avoid ourselves, our pain and fears, and our conditional self-worth. And attaching ourselves to another person or relationship can also give us a sense of value and purpose. Relationships are a means for us to escape the endless pressure of making our own choices and taking care of our own needs and feelings. And finally, enmeshed relationships are a way to avoid the anxiety of feeling separate or alone, which can trigger deep fears of abandonment. But even though some people may seek out enmeshment as an escape from the pressures of their individuality, others deeply fear losing their autonomy in relationships. And for these people, enmeshment feels suffocating and overwhelming. If we're not taught how to engage in relationships in non-enmeshed ways, we may avoid intimacy altogether as a way of trying to hold on to our autonomy. So whether we're seeking enmeshment or desperately running away from it, enmeshment is a learned and typically unconscious way of relating to other people. Both anxious and avoidant behavior in relationships are learned, and often come from having enmeshed or codependent relationships modeled to us as children. And one of the main ways we can recognize codependent or enmeshed relationships is when the balance in the relationship is off. One person is typically taking up more space, and their needs and feelings are more centered in the relationship. We do also see some enmeshed relationships that don't have that element of codependency, where both people may be neglecting their needs and overly focused on the other person. So this can lead to what appears like a more balanced relationship. But if both people have lost their sense of self without the other person, this is a balance that depends on nothing in the relationship significantly changing and neither person being left alone. So why does maintaining our own sense of self matter in our relationships? To answer this question, let's take a deeper dive into enmeshed relationships and what happens when our sense of self starts to become blurry. Even though enmeshment shows up more obviously in our close relationships, it affects the way we relate to everyone in our lives. And enmeshment can happen in any type of relationship and involves the blurring of many types of boundaries. This video will focus mostly on the impacts of emotional enmeshment because that's the type that I see the most often, especially with my clients. But every type of enmeshment does come with its own notable impacts. We can start with intellectual or mental enmeshment, which is a relationship or group where everyone is pressured to think the same way and believe what the majority or the most dominant members of the group believe. In intellectually enmeshed relationships, people are often discouraged or shamed for holding different views and may not learn how to think critically and develop their own thoughts and opinions. Then we have blurry physical boundaries, which can involve a lack of respect for someone else's physical space, body, or privacy, and lead to different forms of treating another person's space or body as if it was their own. Physical enmeshment can make a relationship become unsafe, abusive, or controlling in a way that violates physical autonomy. Then we have role enmeshment, which happens the most clearly in family dynamics, but it can occur in any type of relationship with a built-in power dynamic, like, for example, a supervisor and their employee. And role enmeshment involves different ways that someone is over or under assuming responsibility based on their level of authority in that relationship. An example of this could be the child taking on the responsibilities of a parent or an employee of their supervisor and vice versa. And regardless of how inappropriate the role is that the person has taken on, people often feel confined to the role they end up performing and a strong pressure to carry on within that role, even when it's not in line with their individual preferences. Then we also have behavioral enmeshment with blurry behavioral boundaries, which fits in more with the classic definition of codependency. And that's where we have a relationship with two able adults that come to depend on each other for regulating each other's behavior, completing daily tasks, and meeting their basic needs. And finally, let's come to cultural enmeshment with blurry cultural boundaries. And that's where we feel a pressure to make choices and behave in ways that are not a reflection of our true identity to conform with our cultural group. This is a struggle we see visibly for multiracial people or people who have experienced immigration, who are often excluded from and don't feel like a part of any cultural group because of their inability to fully conform with any one group's standards. And like I said, the last type of enmeshment where we're going to spend the most time is emotional enmeshment. This is one of the most common types I've seen, so it's often taken for granted, but it does come with really significant impacts on our mental health and the health of our relationships. And emotional enmeshment happens when there's a lack of differentiation We can no longer tell the difference between one person's emotions and another's. And this can create this unstated expectation that caring about each other means you feel what I feel. In these relationships, we feel responsible for the other person's emotions, which typically also serves as a flag that we've stopped taking responsibility for our own emotions and directly or indirectly have made the other person responsible for noticing, managing, and even feeling our emotions. So, with this, I want to go into the difference between empathy and compassion. And these are words that people use interchangeably, but they're actually quite different experiences. So, to be as clear as possible, I'm going to define each. Empathy is feeling what other people are feeling, and compassion is feeling deep sympathy and understanding for others while staying rooted in our own emotions. And research shows that empathy activates pain circuitry in our brain, whereas compassion activates pleasure circuitry. With compassion, we're present and attuned to what the other person is saying and feeling, and we're still in touch with our own physical sensations and emotions. So compassion is a way of caring for others that feels good for us and still really deepens our sense of connection to the other person. With empathy, we're taking someone else's feelings into our own body and experiencing them as if they were our own. This can be a beautiful and deep connecting experience when we choose to feel empathy and have ways to reground and come back to our own emotions. But most people engage in empathy unconsciously and without much control over this experience, which leads us to feeling sometimes overcome by the emotions of the people around us and to lose touch with our emotions and our physical sensations when we're around others. Oftentimes, empathy also involves unconsciously amplifying other people's emotions and pain, especially if we're able to access and hold on to more of their pain than that person is consciously feeling themselves. We see this a lot if the other person might be avoiding how they're feeling, and then we're taking their feeling into our body instead. And this can make other people's pain, displeasure, or disappointment feel like a really internally painful experience. And experiencing and even amplifying other people's pain can lead to this really strong desire to avoid conflict or anything that could cause pain or discomfort. We may not only become afraid of causing the other person pain, but of the other person having to feel pain at all. And then our actions become centered around shielding that other person from pain at all costs. This can lead to over-empathizing and over-giving and other people-pleasing, caretaking, or rescuing behavior. So when emotional boundaries become blurry, we're prioritizing harmony above all else, including our own needs and feelings. And one of the biggest warning signs we have that let us know when our emotional boundaries have become blurry is guilt. Guilt doesn't feel good, but it's actually a healthy and constructive emotion. We feel guilt because of actual or perceived harm we've done to another person or ourselves. And the good news about feeling guilty is we're reflecting on our actions and their impacts. And we have guilt and shame, these two moral emotions. And guilt can be actually the more proactive of the two. Shame often damages our sense of self and therefore causes us to freeze, hide, and withdraw. And in the right dose, guilt can give us more energy to take responsibility for our actions, initiate repair with another person, and make necessary and difficult changes. And not everyone feels guilt or is capable of taking this kind of accountability for their actions, particularly in the case of certain personality disorders like narcissistic or antisocial personality disorder. So even though feeling guilt is a really positive sign, the crucial question is how much guilt and how we manage it. Guilt can be a temporary feeling we use constructively, or it can take over and become an emotional baseline for how we feel on a daily basis. When guilt takes over as a baseline emotion, it then becomes the primary motivator for how we live our lives and make decisions, or worse, avoid living our lives and making our own decisions. And the guilt in enmeshed relationships is typically this pervasive kind that grows over time. And we feel this guilt because we've made ourselves responsible for the other person's emotions and therefore also for their needs, their well-being, and their happiness. We've assigned ourselves the impossible task of keeping another person happy and preventing them from feeling pain. And given the impossible nature of this task, we unconsciously fear that we are not enough, we are not doing enough, we are not giving enough, we are not good enough. And this fear is what makes it feel like we are failing the people we love or are doomed to eventually hurt, disappoint, and betray them. This fear is what fuels the guilt that permeates in emotionally enmeshed relationships. And actions we do that give back to the other person and the relationship reaffirm a sense of ourselves as good, loving, loyal, and caring. And acting independently or in a way that focuses on our own needs and what feels good for us can be labeled as selfish and bad. So making decisions and acting for ourselves can start to feel like we're betraying the other person or taking something away from them. Weighed down by the pressure of this constant guilt, people often vacillate between blaming themselves and blaming the other person for how they feel. So we may go back and forth between relentlessly judging ourselves for not feeling good enough and resenting the other person for how weighed down we feel in the relationship. As we over-assume responsibility for the other person's needs and feelings, we're also neglecting to take responsibility for our own. We may then make the other person responsible for our needs and feel like they owe us this or are responsible for how we feel because of how much we've been giving to them. Blaming the other person or ourselves for the guilt we feel is a way we're avoiding actually feeling this guilt and taking action to address how we feel. In reality, no one can make us feel any emotion. Some people may consciously or unconsciously try to manipulate us into feeling certain emotions, including guilt. But as soon as we notice what the other person's doing or even just how we're feeling, the choice about how we respond is our responsibility. Our emotions are our internal experience, and no one is responsible for feeling or managing them except ourselves. Another person can't make us feel guilty if we refuse to take that on, just like we can't make another person happy no matter how much of ourselves we pour into this. This over-prioritizing other people's emotions and neglecting our own needs over time creates a relationship dynamic where it feels like there's not enough space for everyone's needs. So we're measuring how big our love is and how good of a person we are by how much we're willing to sacrifice. And this creates an unconscious inner conflict where it feels like we have to choose between our needs and doing the right thing or what's best for the other person. In reality, there are countless ways we can meet everyone's needs most of the time. And really, with flexibility and open dialogue, we can almost always find a solution that meets everyone's needs to a level where they feel prioritized, cared for, and content. And I want to give an example of this to make this concrete. This is a simple example, but let's take a relationship where one person loves watching sports in their downtime with their partner, and the other person in the relationship would rather do anything else in their downtime besides watching sports. If both of these partners are willing to name how they feel and to name their needs and preferences, this is where they can dialogue and start to find some creative solutions for what may appear at first like a dilemma. And just one example of a solution, of which there are many potential solutions, could be giving the partner who doesn't like watching sports permission to do another activity while still hanging out in the same space as their partner when they're watching sports. And let's say the person who loves sports really just likes having their partner there. They do like being able to talk to their partner about what's going on in the game, but they may feel totally satisfied even if their partner is scrolling on their phone or reading or knitting. And they were able to come to this solution because of naming their feelings and needs. But if we take this same example and look at a relationship where one or both partners are not being honest about how they feel, the partners in the relationship lose the ability to dialogue openly and creatively about how to meet everyone's needs. This makes every decision in the relationship feel like an either-or choice. One person or the other ends up happy, and is what creates this unconscious dread that we're doomed to fail the other person. And as long as we're repressing our needs and feelings, a part of us knows we're not being fully honest in the relationship. So we unconsciously fear that a time will come when we can no longer keep up the act of ignoring our needs and feelings, after which our true nature will come through and we'll be revealed as selfish or a fraud. Many people are terrified of this happening and will try even harder, give even more, because their sense of identity as a good and lovable person has come to depend on this. And if we take this emotional enmeshment in relationship, and this is going on for a long time, we can end up at what's called fusion. Fusion is a relationship where two people become so enmeshed that they lose a separate sense of their own identity and can end up fusing or merging into one identity. This can happen with the different types of enmeshment, but we should be especially careful with blurry emotional boundaries. And in order to understand why fusion happens in particular with emotional enmeshment, let's look at how Marshall Rosenberg, the author of Nonviolent Communication, describes the relationship between our feelings and our needs. The idea in nonviolent communication is that our feelings point to our needs. And a lot of psychotherapy modalities view it the same way. Every emotion we have is a signal trying to get our attention and to let us know what our needs are and how we can meet our needs in that moment. Seeking to understand and meet our needs through paying attention to our emotions is one of the clearest ways we can come to understand ourselves, what we value, and what in life gives us a sense of joy and meaning. So our feelings help us understand our needs, and our needs help us understand ourselves. And in emotionally enmeshed relationships, we're paying less attention to our feelings and needs, and that's how we lose that clear sense of ourselves. Instead, we may come to build a sense of our own worth and capability by attaching ourselves to this other person and attempting to merge with them. And we see fusion happen the most often in intimate relationships with family or a romantic partner, but it can happen in any relationship, including with friends or even with our work, where we're entering with a weak sense of identity and seeking worth from that relationship. And even in relationships where there's that mutual overgiving, everyone is giving everything they have and neglecting their own needs. This still creates an inherent instability in the relationship because over time, fusion erodes at our self-confidence and our sense of independent worth and capability. Then anything that threatens the relationship threatens the sense of identity, purpose, and value for everyone involved. So people in fused relationships often avoid or even sabotage introducing anything new or independent that could jeopardize the relationship. Someone doing something new or on their own may unconsciously be perceived by the other person as a betrayal. And this can bring up really strong emotions and fear that that person doesn't even know how to make sense of. Depending on their childhood conditioning and attachment style, they may cling on even more tightly to the other person, they may withdraw their love and affection, or they may alternate back and forth between hot and cold behavior. And this heightened emotional reactivity to any perceived threat or change in the relationship can lead to unintentionally or intentionally manipulative behavior designed to keep things as they are and not rock the boat. And as people's sense of identity become intertwined, individual needs and choices are set aside more and more, and maintaining harmony is prioritized above all else. This is a harmony that is less about everyone feeling good or fulfilled in the relationship and more about maintaining the status quo and avoiding conflict or change. Anything that shakes up the established status quo of that relationship brings back in the anxiety of feeling separate, which grows over time by virtue of being repressed and avoided for so long. Eventually, the anxiety of feeling separate can grow so strong that anything that triggers this anxiety can feel physically and emotionally overwhelming, painful, and even unbearable. And a real or perceived threat of separation can cause us to feel this deep existential dread and an inner sense of emptiness and meaninglessness. But as terrifying as our fear of being alone or separate may become, I like to think of this fear as a balloon inflated with hot air. All this hot air can make this fear take up a lot of space in our minds and bodies, but it has no real substance. The moment we gain the courage to actually test and poke at the fear, it deflates. And this is because what we fear the most in fused relationships is failing and not being good enough. And the only thing that inflates this fear is our avoidance of ourselves and our needs and feelings. The only way we can see ourselves as not good enough is when we stop being able to see ourselves clearly. And we can't see ourselves clearly when we're unable or unwilling to look at our needs and feelings. Building up the courage to sit with our feelings and our fear gives us the chance to get to know ourselves and our needs again. Finally, we can see where our feelings were coming from and how hard they've been trying to get us to pay attention and honor our needs. This allows us to see our feelings, all of them, as messengers and protectors. And when we see that there's nothing wrong with how we feel, we start to see that there's nothing wrong with what we need. So many of us were not taught growing up that it is okay to have feelings and needs, and a lot of them, and strong ones. Being alive is about feeling and desiring and needing. Our needs are what we value. They are what make life worthwhile and enjoyable. And as we start to see that there is nothing wrong with our feelings or needs, we can start to finally see that there's nothing wrong with who we are. We are all born unconditionally worthy of experiencing love, dignity, and fulfillment. And I say this, and I don't expect you to believe it yet. I don't expect you to believe that you are unconditionally worthy just because I'm telling you it's true. But many people have an easier time recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of other people. So just ask yourself, what makes me so different where I would be unworthy when I can see that others are inherently worthy of love, dignity, and respect? If you're open to sitting with this question and investigating where your conditional sense of worth comes from, I hope that you will eventually see through to it being false. I hope you will eventually to see it as that balloon filled with hot air but no substance. And when we can finally see and feel the truth about our worth, this releases us from the tremendous pressure of our worth and lovability feeling conditional. As we keep sitting with our feelings and recognizing their value, our guilt and that fear driving it eventually release. Because they fulfilled their purpose and gotten our attention. And depending on how big our fear of separateness has grown, we may need to sit with and reprocess this feeling for a long time, ideally with support and in community. But no matter how overwhelming and endless our fear and guilt may feel at first, every feeling is finite and temporary. And on the other side of big feelings are big needs. Acknowledging everyone's needs and looking for creative and mutually supportive ways we can meet them creates a newfound sense of space in our relationships. We have more freedom, and there's still actually deeper connection and intimacy because we're being more real in our relationships. And the greatest freedom comes from that. It comes from inside and feeling whole and honest within ourselves. This wholeness doesn't mean we don't need other people. As humans, we're born with intrinsic needs for social connection and belonging. But what this wholeness means is we're no longer dependent on any one thing or relationship to feel worthy. So yes, all intimate relationships cause us to change and grow, but the question is whether this growth takes us away from ourselves or deeper into ourselves. And there are many relationships that do both, and they're allowing us to get to know and experience certain parts of ourselves on a deeper level, while also maybe avoiding or neglecting other parts. A lot of this comes from the fact that no one relationship can meet every need, but we can always look for other ways and solutions and relationships to meet and fulfill unmet needs. This removes the pressure from any one person or thing needing to fulfill all our needs and allows us to expand and build our sense of self in many different relationships and contexts. Just as we stop holding any one person or thing responsible for meeting all of our needs, we also stop over-assuming responsibility for other people's needs and feelings. And when we stop over-assuming responsibility for other people, we stop taking their feelings as personally. We can finally see that most of the time, the way people feel isn't about us. Even when someone's feelings come up in response to something we did or something we said, these feelings still usually have less to do with us and are more about the other person and the stories they're telling themselves in their head based on their own sense of self. So by setting boundaries that limit and protect our sense of self, we stop taking everything personally and making everything about us. In this way, having strong boundaries that protect our sense of self and limit our sense of self is one of the most loving and generous things we can do in relationships. Boundaries allow us to accept other people and their feelings while staying rooted in ourselves. And when we do this, everyone in the relationship has the space to feel how they feel and need what they need. Our worth no longer depends on others feeling a certain way about us, so everyone can feel what they're feeling without a judgment value being placed on either person. And while we still wish for our loved ones' happiness, we no longer feel responsible for this, and our own happiness no longer depends on how anyone else feels, which allows everyone the space to feel, grow, and change in the relationship without this feeling threatening. And this balance of accepting someone as they are and staying open to them changing creates such an incredible sense of safety and support in our relationships, and it allows us to connect more intimately and authentically with others than ever before. Our boundaries allow us to more clearly and lovingly see other people, and they allow other people to more clearly and lovingly see us. So I'd love to hear what you learned about boundaries and why they mattered. If anything surprised you from this video, and please subscribe to this channel and tune back in for the next videos in this series on how to heal from enmeshment.